Um, our first speaker comes from the Netherlands. This is Chano Aiden. He is in a position at the Delft University of Technology and University of Twente. Twente is a river on the border between the Netherlands and Germany, and they speak Twent Platt there. Anyway, I would like to invite the speaker to join us and to begin. Mijnheer Aiden.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to Shabotalai and the Inanna Foundation. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm not a Seyfo scholar. I'm a philosopher and behavioral scientist, so that will put my presentation a little bit in perspective, I think. So take that into account. A couple of years ago, there was a conference in Rijssen, Hengelo, the Netherlands. And in that conference, I also gave a presentation, and in that conference, I focused on the victims. And my presentation was about how to cope with trauma. Today, I want to talk about the perpetrators, and I want to focus on killing human beings. That will be the topic of my presentation. And I will relate that to certain identity and identification theories. It's a fact that it's not easy killing human beings. It's not easy. Just to give you a couple of examples, in World War II, only 15 to 20% of the soldiers fired at the enemy, not because they couldn't fire at the enemy, but because they didn't want to fire at the enemies. In Vietnam, it took around 52,000 bullets to score one kill in regular infantry units. Again, it is not easy to kill another human being. It seems almost to go against natural inclinations. The other human is usually very real and vivid, someone with hopes, someone with dreams, someone with fears, a mother, a father, maybe a wife, just like the killer. In a way, you could say the killer sees the victim as a little different than himself, and killing another is more or less the same thing as killing yourself, because you see yourself in a kind of in a mirror, and it's not easy to kill yourself. So humans are often unwilling to kill their fellow humans, and even in combat, even in a combat context, mainly shoot to miss, not shoot to hit. Most soldiers shoot to miss. Okay, then the question, how is it possible then that in 2015, human beings were and are slaughtered like cattle? How can you explain that? If you take into account that it's very, very difficult to kill another human being, how then can you explain that human beings are killed today and 100 years ago, just like cattle? So I will focus on the psychological and material mechanisms that enable killing other human beings. And I hope, and of course this is my hope, that this insight in this mechanism could shed some light, some additional light, on the massacres of 2015 and possibly also 1915. So I will focus on psychological and material mechanisms. I will explain later what I mean by material mechanisms. Usually, one cannot do serious injury to another human without first dehumanizing him or her in one's mind. Of course, I don't take into account psychopaths and crazy people that just have a kind of deficiency and just kill people. So the first thing that you have to do if you want to kill another human being is to deny his or her humanness, his human nature. And there are different strategies for dehumanizing another human being. I just focus on three. Creating distance, that can be physical distance, psychological distance, moral, symbolic distance, come back to that. Formation of us-them identities, and I will especially also focus on the role of new media in the formation of us-them identities and dehumanization. And that has to do with my background. I'm a philosopher of technology and interested especially and specialized in human-technology relations, especially devices that increase our human cognition. Let me go through the first one, the first strategy, creating distance. The first thing that you can do is create physical distance. Although it's very difficult to kill a human being, but it doesn't take much distress to lay kilometers of mines which kill hundreds or thousands of people. Because if you don't see the victims and you don't hear them, then it becomes more easy to kill them. Or bomber pilots don't have too much trouble killing hundreds or thousands. I mean, it's not that they don't have traumas after, but it's much easier. It's not that difficult. But then the question is how to explain killing at close and personal range. How can we explain that? Because there is no physical distance. The answer is creating a different kind of distance, namely psychological, moral, symbolic distance. And we know from the literature that moral and symbolic distance in an exclusion explains especially extreme behaviors like genocide. Bandura did quite a lot of research in that direction. Question is, how is it done? How is psychological, moral, symbolic distance created? And part of the answer is the so-called formation of us-them identities. So if we want to answer that question, we have to go into a little bit to identity theory. So how do we form an identity? That should be then the first question. We know, again, from literature, conceptual and empirical, that we frame our identity and develop a sense of self in relation to others. So we always compare ourselves to others. We even discover who we are in relation to others. So we do not have an identity independent of other, in isolation. It's not how it works that way. So our relational identity determines also to a great extent our choice options, both cognitively and morally. How do we form a personal identity? And their values and goals and ideals are relevant. We know that we form ourselves in a certain direction by virtue of identification with certain social values and ideals. Charles Taylor has written extensively about it. Charles Taylor is an Australian philosopher. Okay, but this is only individual, on an individual level. So how does that work on a more group level? How are in-group identities formed? They are formed by identification with a group by virtue of certain shared values and ideals. And if you classify individuals as people just like us, people that have certain similarities to us, then it makes it more difficult to subject these people to acts of terror. If you identify yourself by derogation of groups with presumed foreign values and ideals, then you compare yourself negatively to other. So you could say that knowing your enemy is knowing yourself. And classifying, we know individuals as people unlike us, so different, strange, threatening is a kind of prerequisite for acts of terror. But still, these us-them categorizations are not sufficient to explain mass murder, genocide. You could even say that these are natural. It is a natural thing to categorize different people in us and them. Just think about soccer. So there is the other team, and we are different, and that's also a kind of us-them categorization. So more is needed. More is needed to be able to kill other people. And I have a little theory. I think at least what you need to do is to elevate your own values and ideals to a kind of species ethics. I stole that term actually from Jürgen Habermas, who uses it in a completely different context. But the idea is that if the values and ideals of other people do not fit your species ethics, then you consider them as non-human. And I have a little logical proposition. It goes like this. I'm a philosopher, sorry. So I do logic. Premise one is then only believers in Islamic values, for example, of the type why are humans, the values of a person or group X do not correspond to these Islamic values, then the conclusion is person group or group X is not a human. So what you do is absolutize your own values and make them absolute, and even make them, elevate them into a kind of species ethics. So if other people do not have these values, then they fall outside the human species, outside also the moral circle, and certain values, respect, not killing, etc., do not apply to them anymore. Just to give you a kind of empirical thing, I mean, most Nazis would say, of course, you shouldn't kill human beings, but Jews are not human. That's why you can kill them. So this is how it works. There are two ways of placing others outside this human species, and Nick Haslam has written extensively about this. There is a distinction between so-called animalistic dehumanization and mechanistic dehumanization. Outgroups in animalistic dehumanization are seen as immoral, unintelligent, lacking self-control, and are likened to animals. Cockroaches, bacteria, rats, etc. There is also a so-called mechanistic way of dehumanizing people, namely comparing them to machines or objects, and that also makes it easier to kill them. I want to go to the third method or strategy of humanization, namely new media, which we witness today. So recently, social networking services, just like YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, as well as blogs and glossy magazines, have been used by groups like ISIS. And you see torture, beheadings, other atrocities that are being really carefully designed for broadcast. They are meant for broadcast. And the strange thing is that instead of barrel bombs, which would kill much larger numbers of people, they are more effectively, ISIS displays one-on-one slaughter in kind of Hollywood style. Just to give you a couple of pictures. I mean, you see there on the left this pilot who was burned, and we know that 8 or 9 cameras were used to record it. So it is quite slick, almost Hollywood style. Also, this picture on the right, again, it sounds like almost science fiction. Very slick. And the question is, how does that affect identity formation, and how are these images used to, again, dehumanize people, to create us and them distinctions? And one of the words that, or one of the concepts that I've been working is technical mediation. Social media is then a new way to construct and reconstruct identities and produce images of self and other. The question is, how do these technologies mediate images of self and other and contribute to the dehumanization of victims of genocide? And again, I think here values and ideals are very relevant. So you see that in these videos, identities are in a technical way constructed by projecting certain goals and ideals that, for example, jihadists could identify with. So you see that by portraying human beings in a certain way via these technologies, jihadists could identify with the perpetrators. Because if you show a victim being slaughtered like cattle, then and you put that in a certain context, certain proclamations, ritual proclamations, then you can influence, of course, your potential followers. Knives, for example, are used also in a very particular context. They are staged almost. So you see there that moral and symbolic distancing is occurring, and this is again strengthened by religious proclamations. You can say that if you take Haslam's distinction to analyze that, so the distinction between animalistic and mechanistic dehumanization, when it comes to knives, the emphasis is on animalistic dehumanization. So these people, these victims, are portrayed like animals, just like you kill a sheep or a chicken. You see that they are staged in that way. Just to compare another technology, knives can be considered technology, but drones are also technologies, and then you could even say that you find a kind of video game warfare. Also a type of physical and technical mediated distancing. All that the drone's pilots see are pixels, So there, if you again use that distinction or that categorization, there the emphasis on mechanistic dehumanization. So humans are reduced to object, to things, and then again it makes it more easy to kill them. I'm not telling you, okay, this is justified or not justified when it comes to drones, but just giving you a kind of similarity, yeah? So I come to a conclusion. I think I'm on time. Yeah, okay.
You give a good example.
Yeah, thank you. I like that. So I'm still exploring. Again, I'm not a Seyfo scholar, but I try to see whether analyzing this mechanism will help us also to understand what happened in 1915 and to understand what is going on today in 2015, and maybe also to prevent future atrocities and genocide. So the question is then, how can identifying moral and technical mechanisms of dehumanizing help us to better analyze and grasp how in 1915 and 2015 humans were and still are willing to slaughter other humans? And again, you have to take into account that it's not easy to kill another human being. A lot has to be prepared, a lot has to be done. Certain strategies are important there. Otherwise, people do not just decide, it's a nice day, let kill a couple of human beings. So it doesn't work that way. Yeah. So the question is, how can this analysis help us to identify tendencies and preparations of mass murder and genocide at an early stage and prevent, hopefully, future atrocities? So how can we learn from the past? And I think, and this is again just exploring, we could analyze how Syriacs were portrayed as rats, bacteria, disease, so focusing on how they were dehumanized in a certain way by comparing them to different other species, to different animals. Or the type of propaganda. Also, propaganda is a kind of technology that you use that was used to prepare populations to commit mass murder in 1915 and 2015. Again, it's not easy to kill another human being. Or how public executions were and are still staged in 1915 and 2015. And again, I'm a philosopher of technology. I'm especially interested in how technologies mediate in identity formation and have contributed to the organization of violence and terror in 1915 and 2015. So I would be, for example, very curious whether certain Seyfo scholars have studied animations or posters. I don't know if they existed during that time, and how Syriacs or Armenians were portrayed in these posters or animations that could also help us to use that information and insight and compare it to what is going on today in Syria and Iraq and maybe learn from it. So I'm very open for working together with Seyfo scholars. Thank you.
So thank you a lot. Discussion, as far as this discussion is concerned, we will do the discussion after the panel. So our next speaker she has an Armenian name, Anahit Khosroyeva. She works in Armenia, and the title of her paper is The Significance of the Assyrian Genocide After a Century. So most of you will know that Armenians, and not all Syrians, but most of them share the same Miaphysitic dogma. They lived intertwined in Mesopotamia before the First World War, so their fate is to a certain degree comparable. So, Ms. Khosroyeva, actually you have a Persian name with a Russian suffix and an old Iranian Christian name. There is actually in the Avesta a yash to Ardvi Sura Anahita, to the old Iranian goddess of Anahita. So I hope, despite the almost tragical content of these papers, you enjoy her presence. Nu, пожалуйста.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, my name is Armenian name, even it is an Persian origin, I know that, but I'm half Armenian, half Assyrian, so sharing this destiny of our people. And today the topic of my paper is the significance of the Assyrian genocide when we are looking from nowadays perspective, years, a century later. The Assyrian genocide, along with Armenian and Greek genocides, was the first intent ethnic cleansing and mass extermination of the 20th century, which occurred in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. Hundreds of thousands of Assyrians perished as the result of execution, deportation, starvation, diseases, the harsh environment, and physical abuse. The systematic manner in which the massacres and slaughters of Assyrians was conducted, along with the documented intentions of Turkish leaders and sheer number of individuals murdered, demonstrate that the Turkish government planned and to a great extent succeeded in fulfilling a policy of genocide toward the Assyrian people. The First World War was an ideal context in which Ottoman state could accomplish this goal. The war not only observed the resources and focus of the world's major powers, but it also created a morally ambiguous atmosphere where brutality and death on a massive scale could be justified or trivialized. The Assyrians, whose Christian identity and cultural durability were perceived by Turkish nationalists to be undesirable obstacles to the realization of a pan-Turkic nation, found themselves barriers of a misfortune with reverberations lasting to this very day. Genocide is not an auction, but a continual process. The International Association of Genocide Scholars mentions 10 stages of genocide: classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and denial. So, it is an unfortunate historic truth that the Assyrian tragedy went through all these stages. There is no any doubt that in the Assyrian case, all 5 criteria in both Article 2 and Article 3 of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide apply, and we may say a real genocide against the Assyrian people was implemented according to the criteria of international law. But the genocide is not only a crime against a particular people, in our case, against Assyrians. It is also a crime against humankind. Its inherent potential is to distort and alter the very meaning of humankind, erasing for all time particular biological and cultural possibilities. Furthermore, for a particular group to claim for itself a right to determine what groups are, in effect, human, possessing the right to life, is to threat to the existence of all other humans. In a period in which genocide has claimed an enormous number of victims, with no end to the carnage inside, the prevention of future acts of genocide becomes a task for all human beings and governments throughout the world. So, with the criminal connivance of the world's major powers and taking the opportunity presented by the martial law, Turkey committed the gravest crime against humanity, genocide. This genocide and its consequences have become an irreversible component of not only the national tragedy and loss of the Assyrian identity and memory, but also of the struggle, national revival, and continuation of life. Let us see what was the cause of the Assyrian genocide in the Ottoman Empire, and could it be possible to avoid it? What are the consequences of the century-long not recognition and denial of the Assyrian genocide, certainly the Armenian and Greek genocide along with it? The professional investigation of the anatomy of the Ottoman Empire by a lot of worldwide scholars let us deduce that the latter bore crime and genocide and topologically could be categorized as genocidal state. The Ottoman state system, with inclination to slaughters and genocide, had provided itself with an adequate concept, a theoretical foundation for the preparation and perpetration of, in our case, the Assyrian genocide. The Armenian genocide counts as the first modern genocide when a modern state, with its destructive power out of ideological radicalization, identified part of its own civilians as undesirable. This genocide, presently understood by much of the world to have been the climax of a long history of oppression and violence for a group that had suffered for centuries as a Christian minority at the hands of the Turks. Unfortunately, achieving the global remembrance of the genocide against the Armenians seems to have downplayed the fate of all other Christian minority groups in the Ottoman Empire, such as Assyrians and Pontic Greeks, that suffered from ethnic cleansing and mass murder at the hands of Sultan Abdul Hamid II and Young Turks. These three Christian minorities were part of the tissue of the Ottoman society, and suddenly their state decided to eliminate them. Historians who realize that the Young Turks population and extermination policies have to be analyzed together and understood as an entity are therefore often attempt to speak of a Christian genocide. The destruction of the Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks was one aspect of the homogenizing process. Nevertheless, the suffering of the Assyrians is largely forgotten internationally and not recognized as genocide, which embitters the descendants of the victims. This ancient civilized nation first faced the menace of total physical extermination in the name of bringing about the insane plans of the Young Turks to create a pure Turkish state and great Turan. The genocidal quality of the murderous campaigns against Assyrians is obvious. The Assyrian genocide occurred in the same circumstances as the Armenian genocide. It was part of the same process, taking place in the same locations at the same time and by the same enemy. When on July 23, 1908, the Young Turks Party Union and Progress organized a revolt and seized the power, all the people of the empire, Muslims or Christians, vigorously welcomed the overthrow of the Red Sultan. They hoped it was the dawning of a new age in the history of the Ottoman Empire. But as appeared shortly after, the Young Turks were ardent nationalists who continued the policy of oppressions and slaughters carried out prior to them by sultans. They were advocates of the idea of assimilation of all the peoples of the empire to create a pure Turkish nation, never stopping even before mass killings in order to execute that idea. The Young Turks intended to transform the pluralistic Ottoman Empire into a homogeneous national state. Not any Christians could have part in such a new society. The ambitions of the Young Turks, however, exceeded these primary goals. According to Turkish professor Taner Akçam, the Committee of Union and Progress had prior to World War I formulated a policy that they began to execute in the Aegean region against Greeks, and during the war years expanded to include the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Syrians, and especially the Armenians, a policy that eventually became genocidal. Detailed reports were prepared outlining the elimination of the Christian population. End of quote. The governor of the province of Diyarbakir, Rashid Bey, directed some of the earliest extermination in his regions. The Assyrians of the Mardin, Midyat, Urfa, and Jazira regions were especially victimized. Most brutal slaughters of tens of thousands Assyrians were perpetrated here. The priest of local Chaldean Assyrians in the province of Diyarbakir, Reverend Joseph Naim, reported that the massacres in this region had taken place since April 8, 1915. The culprits gathered men over 16 years of age, beat, tortured, killed them, and afterwards put turbans on their heads and photographed them in order to prove to world in the future that Christians were oppressing Muslims, not vice versa. The massacres of the Assyrians, genocidal by nature, were continuing in every region of the Ottoman Empire, where mass slaughters reached unprecedented levels. The Assyrian villages and towns were sacked by organized mobs or by Kurdish bands. Tens of thousands were driven from their homes. Their property was plundered. Thousands of Assyrian women and girls were forced into Turkish and Kurdish harems. The slaughters were perpetrated as barbarously as possible, regardless of gender or age. The manner in which the Assyrian genocide was organized and implemented serves as irrefutable evidence of the Turkish authorities' decision to eliminate a people whose nationalism and Christian identity ran contrary to the young Turks' own ethnic and religious chauvinism. Even German consular officials believed that the anti-Christian actions were centrally planned. On March 7, 1915, for example, in his letter to the German ambassador in Constantinople, the German vice-consul in Alexandria wrote, "During the last few days, house-to-house searches took place at all the homes of the Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire residing here. Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, on order from higher up, mostly likely from Constantinople." End of quote. The Ottoman state, instead of protecting its own citizens, killed or deported them to deserts, stole their belongings and properties, kidnapped their children, took their females to Turkish and Kurdish harems. The governor of Van, Cevdet Bey, led a butcher regiment of 8,000 Muslim soldiers that perpetrated mass slaughters. All possible methods of killing were used: shooting, stabbing, stoning, crushing, throat cutting, throwing off of roofs, drowning, and decapitation. It is absolutely impossible to read the multiple trustworthy documents describing those atrocities and remain apathetic or indifferent. One document reads, "The skulls of small children were smashed with rocks. The bodies of girls and women who resisted rape or conversion to Islam were chopped into pieces. Men were mostly beheaded or thrown into the nearby river. The clergy, monks, and nuns were skinned or burned alive." End of quote. The genocide of the Assyrians was perpetrated with unspeakable brutality. Dr. Johannes Lepsius, German Protestant missionary, was an eyewitness, quoting, "how Turks hang lots of innocent Assyrians at the gates of Van, in one of the central streets of the town. When some of them tried to protect themselves and fight back, they all were arrested and killed. I wish I could keep silent about that horrible tragedy." End of quote. The Assyrian genocide was by no means accidental or unexpected. It logically derived from the brutal, nationalistic, and carnivorous policy pursued by the Turkish sultans and later the Young Turks against the non-Turkish minorities during the preceding decades. It was not a policy of individuals, but an official state policy, which pendulum swung between persecution and carnage. Today, the policy of Republic of Turkey toward this issue is absolute denial. Certainly, the consequences of denial are deep and lasting, not only for the descendants of the Assyrians, but also for Turkey itself, in large and small way. We like it or not, today Turkey plays an important role internationally and regionally, and the recognition of a genocide would, in the long term, make the country appear stronger and more trustworthy to all. For us Assyrians, the Assyrian genocide is an unfinished chapter in world history, for the guilty party has yet to receive the punishment it deserves. The lessons of history show that different peoples pay dearly when crimes against humanity are forgotten. The size of a people has no significance when the theory of race worship is raised to the level of an official state policy. But unfortunately, now, after 100 years, our global political institutions still having difficulties and cannot call this crime by its name. I appreciate your time.
Now it is my pleasure to announce somebody not only from Germany, not only from Berlin, but also from Freie Universität. Tessa Hoffmann, she is now retired. Before she was working at the Osteuropa Institute, at the Institute for Eastern European Studies. If you permit me, if you ask Dr. Hoffmann later questions, please do it in a written form. This is easier for her to perceive. So after your talk, to which you are now kindly invited, we have the discussion, and please keep in mind that to Dr. Hoffmann you should ask your questions in a written form.
Dear colleagues, I'm very grateful that my university, where I have worked for 31 years, until April this year organizes an international conference on the Ottoman genocide against Aramaic speakers. In doing this, a tradition is continued which has been established 13 years ago when an international conference at the Technical University of Berlin explored for the first time, even by international standards, the Ottoman genocide in an all-inclusive way. The publication of these proceedings saw 2 German editions and also 1 Turkish. A month ago, the oldest Berlin university, the Humboldt University, together with the University of Constance, organized a conference on the genocide against Aramaic speakers, which deserves to be mentioned here. But while the case of Seyfo saw 2 academic conferences in the course of just 1 month, to this day no academic conference on the Armenian or Greek cases has taken place at any university in the German capital city. My hope is that in future the comparative inclusive approach of the initial conference will be continued. Exploring individual cases in the framework of the Ottoman genocide against non-Muslims, we are always confronted with the 5 W's of genocide scholarship. A 6th question relates to the modus operandi, and the last issue concerns the contextualization and comparability of the crimes in question. In other words, was the Seyfo a singular, exclusive occurrence, as the use of an Aramaic term instead of the legal term genocide suggests? Or was it part and parcel of the general destruction of indigenous Christian populaces of Asia Minor and Mesopotamia during the last decade of Ottoman rule? It seems that still we have more questions than ready answers, starting with the definition of the perpetrators. Here, the regimes of Ittihad Teraki Cemiyeti, as well as the Kemalist nationalists of the 1919 to 1922 period come to mind. However, by far not all members of the COP and not even a central committee have been involved into genocidal conspiracy and preparation. On the other hand, as a result of the patrimonial Ottoman system, a large part of the Muslim population seems to have been actively involved into massive pillage, robbery, rape, enslavement, and killings of Christians. In the collective memory of Aramaic speakers, the destructive role of Kurds is especially highlighted, whereas the French Armenian historian Raymond Kevorkian mentions in his opus magnum that the participation of the Kurds is generally overestimated. In addition, regular and irregular Ottoman forces committed massacres of Christian civilians both inside the Ottoman provinces of Van and Bitlis and also in northwest Iran during the temporary Ottoman occupation of 1914 and 1918. Who then were the victims? If we regard the Seyfo as an integral part of the overall destruction of Ottoman Christians, the two large Christian millets come to mind first. That is, the up to 3 million Romias or Romiosini, as the Orthodox Greeks heirs of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire would define themselves still in the early 20th century, followed in numbers by 2.5 million ethnic Armenians, of whom most would belong to the Ermeni millet, that is, the Armenian Apostolic Church. As early as 1909, genocidal rhetoric of the Young Turks has been articulated against the Greek Orthodox Christians as a whole. The Romirs were not only traditionally perceived as hostile and a challenge to national security, but increasingly as economic competitors of the rising Muslim bourgeoisie. At least since the Balkan Wars, verbal threats transformed into discriminatory practice and economically destructive restrictions, accompanied by early massacres of Greeks, such as Phocaea in mid-June of 1914, and by deportations first in eastern Thrace and then in Ionia. However, the conflicting interests among Turkey's allies and war enemies prevented a general destruction of Ottoman Greeks during the First World War, limiting death marches and massacres to the Pontus region until the temporary Russian occupation in 1917 saved the Pontic Greeks for the next 2 years. Starting with Mustafa Kemal's disembarkation in Samsun in May 1919, the so-called Kemalist liberation struggle brought the last and decisive phase of the Genoktonia en Roi, or genocide in flow, as the destruction of Ottoman Greeks has been named by Greek scholars. Whereas the destruction of more than 1 million Greek Orthodox Ottomans took a decade, the destruction of 1.5 million Ottoman Armenians out of a pre-war population of 2.5 million took just 19 months. Subsequently, the concentrated, systematic annihilation of more than 60% of a designated victim group became paradigmatic for the entire de-Christianization of Asia Minor. The genocide against the Ottoman Armenians undoubtedly represents the benchmark for comparative studies of Ottoman genocide. How do the Aramaic speakers fit into this framework? Here we must realize that most of the currently used collective terms were unknown to non-Aramaic contemporaries. Not only were the Aramaic speakers the quantitatively smallest victim group, but religiously they were also the most fragmented, although they would commonly self-identify as Soyoye or Suyaya in Western and Eastern Aramaic respectively. In difference to this, European contemporaries as well as Ottoman authorities did not perceive Aramaic speakers as a linguistic, cultural, or ethnic unit, but as members of separate denominations. In German archival documents, we have subsequently to look out for Syriacs, Jacobites, Syriac Catholics, Nestorians, or Chaldeans in their various ways of spelling, and we will neither find Arameans nor Assyrians in German primary sources. Instead, tribal names such as the Nestorian tribe of Tiari sometimes occur. Exploring the reasons for the state-induced destruction of the Ottoman Christians, we must keep in mind that genocide is usually multifunctional. This applies in particular to genocide committed in periods of war or social and political transformation, as it was the case in the Ottoman Empire. Today, most historians and scholars of genocide agree that national state building in the late Ottoman Empire constituted the driving force of demographic homogenization. In this process, Armenians and Greek Orthodox Christians were perceived as not adaptable to the future Turkey of the Turks. They had therefore to be expulsed or exterminated, preferably the latter, since the earlier experience of the Balkan Wars had proven that surviving refugees and deportees would return after a war or after a conflict. Adding to such calculations was the demographic balance of Muslims against non-Muslims as reached in the late 19th century, a demographic situation near to equilibrium seemed to have incited Muslim elites to push matters further. The equilibrium of populaces was not the result of natural growth, but of war, expulsion, and subsequent immigration of up to 7 million Muslim refugees in the course of Russia's genocidal conquest of the North Caucasus and related areas since the late 18th century, of the Russian-Ottoman War of 1877 and 8, and the already mentioned Balkan Wars of 1912 and 13. Territorial losses, the experience of killings, rape, and pillage of the non-combatant Muslim population during these events, and also forced baptism, aroused, to quote Halide Edip, the feeling that in order to avoid being exterminated, the Turks must exterminate others. Another relevant component in the blend of Ottoman motives for genocide were religious despise and hatred against Christians. Such sentiments emerged from the Muslim traditional law system that in its turn bases on the institutions of dimitude and jihad. In her doctoral thesis, the British scholar Badior characterized the Armenian genocide as a jihad. Although many Muslim Turks and Arabs disapproved of this crime and refused to participate, it must be noted These massacres were perpetrated solely by Muslims, and they alone profited from the booty, the possession of the victims, their homes, their fields, which were left to the muhajirun, and the allocation of enslaved women and children. The selection of the boys from the age of 12 was in line with the rules of jihad. From that age, the jizya must be paid. The 4 stages of the liquidation, deportation, enslavement, forced conversion, and massacre reflect the historical circumstances in which the jihad since the 7th century was conducted in the Dar al-Harb. End quote. For justice sake, it must be mentioned that the Ottoman proclamation of jihad on 14th November 1914 had been instigated by German policy, whose spiritus rector became the Oriental scholar, wartime diplomat, and archaeologist Max von Oppenheim, dubbed by contemporaries Abu Jihad. However, Oppenheim's imperialist plan to incite to insurgency the Muslim colonies of Britain and France failed. Ottoman War Minister Enver used the proclamation of jihad to inflate the religious hatred of Muslim people inside and outside the empire against the internal enemies, that is, the indigenous Christians. About a year later, Johannes Lepsius explained the young Turkish concept of jihad in a non-public lecture in Berlin for journalists. Quotation: "The war is not a war of the believers versus the infidels, but simply a Turkish war, albeit against all non-Turks." I would like to add 2 further relevant motives. As every genocide, and the Ottoman genocide in particular, this was an amply used opportunity for unpunished predatory murder. Finally, the Armenians' seemingly successful fight for the implementation of administrative reforms, as enshrined in the Berlin Treaty of 1878, provided an additional motive for the Young Turks to finish off with the Armenians once the Great War provided an opportunity. Most of these motives, namely religious hate, suspicion of high treason, and revenge, are at least partly applicable to the 3 typical situations in which the Soyoye or Soyaya found themselves. Inside the empire, the first massacre of Syriacs occurred as early as autumn 1914. And as a consequence, the Nestorian Patriarch Mar Binyamin Shimon the 21st declared war against Turkey, according to the decision of a great tribal assembly prompted by the advance of Turkish forces and Kurdish volunteers. I now will briefly summarize the rest of my presentation. It is a typology of the situations inside Iran and the 2 Ottoman provinces of Van and Bitlis, in which the Nestorians, at least the Nestorians of the Hakkari district in the Van province, were more or less military and political players. But the situation in the Diyarbakir province was entirely different. Therefore, some scholars have emphasized that this was an extraordinary situation in which, alongside the Armenians, Aramaic speakers became victims of the Armenian genocide, subsidiary victims, as Mark Levin called it, or secondary victims. It was also emphasized by Donald Bloxham that this co-suffering of the Aramaic-speaking Christians in the Diyarbakir province was a singular case. Well, this is not quite so, because if you look into the memoirs of US Consul Leslie Davis, he mentioned, at least for the Mamoret Ul Aziz or Harput province that he called the slaughterhouse province, that the deportation order concerned the Armenians and the Syriacs as well. So I leave it here and thank you for your attention.
The floor is now open to discussion.
Thank you for Mr. Aydin for having focused on psychological, ethical and moral motivation and consideration in the genocidal process. When I was listening to you, I remember many documents, many sources. I will speak about them this afternoon. Within them, this aspect is raised by many witnesses, many scholars, many writers. They have written about genocide under the title of reflection on moral and ethical consideration on the war and on the genocide. I haven't a question, it is just a very positive appreciation of your speech, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. It kind of gave me a kind of illumination, because you explained very clearly and very logically the mechanism of dehumanization, and one of the basic facts is the creation of this dichotomy between us and them, and the various stages through which it can go until the point is reached where you can kill other human beings without any problem. And I would just like to point to the fact that the religion of Islam is not only particularly helpful to establish such a mechanism, but Islam in fact is based on this dichotomy of us and them. And it is also based on violence, and so you have the two main factors which can lead very easily to slaughters and massacres and genocides. And this is what was practiced from the first minute of the creation of the religion of Islam. And this is what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has already practiced. And so I think that the historical preponderance of genocides perpetrated by the Muslims is not a mere coincidence. Thank you.
For Dr. Aydin, I also want to thank you for your talk. It was very, very interesting. I have two questions for you. How does reluctance to kill relate to volunteer soldiers as opposed to soldiers that were drafted by the government? And the second question is, isn't the task of preventing terror groups like ISIS from forming when we have state terror by alleged moral nations like the US making propaganda to invade another country and destroy Iraq, for instance?
If I may, I respond very briefly to the previous person who asked a question about Islam, or made a comment about Islam. I think it would be very important to analyze how from the Islamic religion, certain values and norms are absolutized. Absolutized in the sense of if you do not value, if you do not respect these norms and ideals, then you fall outside the human species. So if that would be the case, then that would indeed fit my, let's say, theory of this species ethics. So this idea that if certain values and ideals do not apply to you and you elevate your ideals and values in such a degree that if other people do not value them, respect them, then they fall outside the moral circle, then indeed that would be a kind of proof almost that in the Islamic religion there is already fundamentally a kind of tendency to kill other people that do not, that have different values and ideals. Yeah, that seems not to coincide, at least, with this basic tendency. And so it would be interesting to compare also on that ground the religious and the Christian values. I'm very curious, so I'm very open to collaborate also with Seyfo scholars and theologians and philosophers of Christianity. Your question about how about people who voluntarily kill other humans, and they seem not to be forced to do that. I think your question is that doesn't seem to completely fit in the framework that I have presented. So this idea that it's quite difficult to kill another human being and you do not do it voluntarily, so that I would go against this framework. I don't completely agree. I think it's not, I mean, it's also, the question is also how did they prepare? So you have to also look at the social context. And if from the beginning, for example, humans with other values are portrayed like bacteria, like animals, and they prepare this process of dehumanization, then they also might invite even other people to volunteer and indeed kill humans. But I want to emphasize that if I say, okay, we have to analyze these mechanisms and we have to understand them, I mean, that doesn't mean that we should not also morally condemn.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Dr. Aydin, for your wonderful presentation. Talking about the last in your presentation, in the last part you mentioned about Seyfo, Islamic State, and moral and technical dehumanization. You were speaking about the analysis, and one of the points was when they comparing celiacs with rats diseases. May I know who are you quoting? Because in Armenian case, we know that young Turks being as medical doctors, usually they were comparing Armenians with diseases like cancer or, and in this case, usually we do compare, when we compare it with Rwanda genocide, we're telling like in cockroaches, like Tutsis. So who are you quoting in this case? Because this was something new for me. For celiacs, they were calling them rats or calling in some diseases. Thank you so much.
I'll try to keep it very, very brief. Again, I'm not a Seyfo scholar, so I would be interested in the usage of these images, these animals, in dehumanization processes. But if I'm if I'm correct, then the Valley of Mardin compares, I think, Armenians with bacteria. At least I remember that David Bond, the governor of Diyarbakir, so that would be somebody who used this concept of bacteria to compare Armenians with them. Is that an answer to your question?
Do the Armenian scholars Aramaic speakers as usual is mentioned, or how do you call the people in Armenia as far as the Seyfo question is concerned? And how is the relationship still in Armenia? I think you live in Armenia, no? So how is the impression? Because we do have always a kind of Aramaic speakers, and I don't know what the people mean under this term only. I don't know, probably. How do the Armenians call the Assyrians, Syriacs, Chaldeans, and so on, and not only simply Aramaic speakers?
So you know, on March 24th, 2015, Armenian government passed this resolution on recognition of Assyrian genocide. Yeah, they call them Assyrians, but of course they know this denomination of Syriacs and Chaldeans including. Thank you.
There's just one question, and I'm grateful for it. It sounds, if your premise of religious hatred was a motive for the genocide, how do you explain so many examples of Muslims protecting Christians and refusing to participate? Well, first of all, let us define what was protection. Many Muslims did take in Christian children, women and boys until an age of 12 or 14. But that was far, in most cases, that was far from being altruistic. Because these women and adults often became sexual slaves and slaves in the households of Muslims into which they were forcibly brought. That is something I would not define as genuine protection. But there had been cases, of course, when neighbors or friends or persons with a long established intercommunal friendship cared for the Christians who all of a sudden were dehumanized, were excluded from the average society. To answer this question precisely, one would need empirical research, and so far I know only one such empirical research done by Richard Hovhannisyan on the Armenian case, where he researched survivors' narratives. And it is interesting that in these narratives, quantitatively, Turks are mentioned at that ethnicity which more than others protected, whatever that meant. Richard Hovhannisyan has not very precisely defined what protection meant, but saving lives, Turks are mentioned more than others as lifesavers. Refusing to participate, well, this relates in particular to state officials, Ottoman state officials, who at various levels of bureaucracy refused to conduct deportation orders. With various explanations. Some of them were simply replaced by more obedient servants, civil servants. Some were murdered, and murder in particular occurred again in that province of Diyarbakir with the responsible Vali Reshid, who in several cases gave the order to murder lower-ranking officials who had refused the deportation orders. But again, we need, in order to answer the question, we need more research, empirical research, not only on the Armenian case, but it would be interesting to compare these findings of Richard Hovhannisyan with new findings in the cases of Greeks or of Aramaic speakers.
Thank you for your presentation. I highly appreciate always your work. Actually, I have a question, but before that, triggered by one of your slides, I need to make a comment. We were on a panel in Stuttgart, you remember? Speaking with one voice in Stuttgart at the university, and you said, could be, you said we as people, Syriac, we should respect each other, and because we are asking for recognition from others, we should also have, let me say, the attitude to respect each other's views. What I have seen on your slide, you said one language, two ethnicity. I think this is a political motivated statement by some organizations, which has no validity, not in history and not in presence. Again, it's a political statement here on your slide. Please correct maybe in the future by doing some research. I can only cite Our Holiness, which we have the pleasure to have him among us, who said all Syriac churches are one nation, one blood. And this is also acknowledged and said also by other Syriac church leaders. So we are not two ethnicities, we are one ethnicity, but divided maybe after the genocide by geography. But my comment, sorry, later on. But my question is to you as an Armenian genocide researcher. If you go back, here state two ethnic identities, and this is, I think, has no basis to me. Please review in the future. I would beg you for that. My comment is, as a researcher on many Armenian questions, could you maybe tell us why the Armenians in the 80s, even until the 90s, up to now, they have not, let me say, gave or shed light also on the suffering of the other Christian nations, Syriacs or Greeks? Because you have dealt with many sources and you know many of the researchers. Could you give us some motivation for this? Thank you.
I come back to the question of two ethnicities. Well, at least in foreign languages, when you use words like Assyrians and Arameans, how can outsiders understand that you mean one identity? That is beyond my understanding. So if you want to emphasize unity, please use one unifying term. Otherwise, you cannot expect that non-Aramaic speaking persons understand that in Aramaic you use one word. You cannot expect us. Sorry for being strict here, but I know this discourse for decades, and I see no other way out than to find among yourself, to find a collective term in foreign languages, in English and other foreign languages, which unifies all members. That's not our task, that's your task. So the second question was about Armenians. Now, I'm not answering here for Armenians, I cannot. I'm not an Armenian, as you know.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad that we're finally talking openly in Germany about the horrors and crimes committed in the late Ottoman Empire and in other places. It's taken a long time, but finally we are here. At the same time, I'm speaking as a historian and as someone who teaches Islamic studies, and I'm deeply unhappy with the way the discussion is going from time to time. I do not think that we will properly understand and analyze the horrors of that period through constructing lines of continuity from Genghis Khan to the modern period. If we do that, I think we fall into the same trap that's been used with regard to the German Holocaust and mass murder and destruction of Jews, which was also by some linked to some primordial characters of the German people. This is not, I think, a helpful way. And the same applies
to the depiction of Islam as only the religion of jihad. A lot has been written about jihad in Islam. It's known, it has to be studied, and it's not irrelevant in the present context. However, jihad is not the same as genocide. But there are, whose work I know quite well because I've worked on Jews in the modern Middle East. But there is an extremely problematic source with an agenda of her own, who is not a specialist on Islam or jihad, and therefore I would really invite you not to take her as your prime witness and not to look at what happened at that particular time. And you are one of the leading experts, I know that full well, through the lens of Badiar and her view of things, and not to drag the discussion into a depiction of Islam as jihadi and genocidal. It's really not helpful.
I don't know if you want to answer to this, Chris?
My main question, Professor Hoffman, was regarding this slide. You seem to have homogenized all Syriac Orthodox as being Arameans, whereas it's very clear that there are many Syriac Orthodox that identify as Assyrians. And this photograph from 1920 actually it's of the Assyrian orphanage, or the Syriac orphanage in Adana. And it says here, Malfono Yolufet Madrashto Othuraito Dibqiliqia, Adana Asuri Dukur Maktabi. And so you should also realize that since the 1920s and possibly even earlier, that many Syriac Orthodox or Jacobites actually call themselves Oturoye and maybe not Oromoye. But you need to also take that into account, because people might not know, and they would see your slide and think that it is as homogeneous as you portrayed it.
I second actually my colleagues' remarks. All three of the panelists are working on a binarism. Binarism of us and others, we and others, Muslims and Christians. These are not productive divides. I would argue that in all three cases, reality is much more complex, and we cannot work if we do not go beyond these. This is how the Armenian-Turkish things were like in the year 2000 when we started with the workshop on Armenian-Turkish scholarship. Unless Armenians and Turks and others and Assyrians put their differences aside and try to realize what happened without blaming, I think that is when we move forward. And you cannot blame a religion, whatever the religion may be.
Well, let me return to the remark that among Syriac Orthodox people, there are those who self-identify as Assyrians. Don't get me wrong, I'm not the one who is identifying anybody. I'm just, sorry, but that was an attempt somehow to summarize the fragmentarization and the difficulties of coming together. But I'm not identifying neither Assyrians nor Arameans. They identify themselves.
Why don't you say that as opposed to this?
I can't, we discussed that at lunchtime, okay? The more general remark about religion, again, I beg you not to be misunderstood. I am not ascribing to any religion that it causes genocide. Religion usually is a secondary motive. But I may ask, I have the scholarly freedom to ask, which role did it play at that genocide in the early 20th century in a country which predominantly had become Muslim? And it may be permitted to mention some facts as demographic developments without being misunderstood as anti-Islamic. If we cannot discuss these questions and aspects,
And I think scholarship does not make much sense. We need that liberty to discuss religion as well. But again, I invite you to discuss this over lunch.
This phrase about liberty was a good final point. So I wish you a pleasant lunchtime. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for speaking.